Don't kill me, cowboy. I'll serve you myself any way you want, the Apache woman pleaded. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Cold dusk settled over Red Mesa Crossing with a stillness that made every sound stand out. The wind had dropped, leaving the land quiet except for the faint scrape of dry brush shifting against the cracked earth. Braden Colehart rode along the narrow trail leading toward his cabin, keeping a steady pace as his horse crossed the last stretch of open ground. He had spent the entire day in town picking up supplies, fixing a broken stirrup, and avoiding unnecessary conversations, and now the fading light pressed against his shoulders like another weight he did not need. Braden was 37, tall, and shaped by years of ranch work. His coat carried dust from the road, and the edges of his hat were worn from sun and wind. He lived alone by choice, partly because isolation kept trouble away, and partly because the emptiness felt quieter than conversations he couldn't maintain anymore. His younger brother had been shot during a cattle raid years before, and Braden had never shaken the guilt of not being there that night. Since then, he had focused on maintaining his land, keeping predators away from the livestock, and staying far from the conflicts brewing around the borderlands. He was returning home to finish repairing a water trough before the next cold wind came through. He loosened his grip on the reins when the horse slowed on its own near two fallen juniper trees blocking part of the trail. He had passed this point hundreds of times, but the quiet felt different today. The shadows looked deeper than usual, and the air held a faint tension that sharpened his senses. Braden reached for the revolver on his hip instinctively, not because he wanted to fight, but because living alone demanded caution. As he passed the first trunk, he heard a soft, dragging sound, followed by a thin breath that didn't belong to any animal he recognized. He pulled the horse to a stop and let the silence settle again. Another breath came, pained, uneven, and close. Braden stepped down from the saddle carefully, boots pressing into the dust without making much noise. His fingers wrapped around the revolver's grip while his eyes scanned the ground under the trees. He had seen raiders hide near this trail before, and he had no intention of being caught off guard. He moved toward the sound, stopping beside a cluster of rocks. Something shifted behind the larger juniper trunk, slow, weak, and human. Before he could speak, a young Apache woman pushed herself into view. She struggled to rise, her hands slipping on the dirt as she tried to kneel. When she managed to get upright, her legs trembled violently, and she lowered her head as if expecting a blow. Her deerskin dress was torn at the neckline, exposing more of her chest than she seemed comfortable with, and she clutched the broken fabric with one hand. Her hair, braided and threaded with leather ties and feathers, was tangled and dusty. Scratches covered her shoulders, and deep bruises darkened her wrists. She lifted her eyes to him, and the raw fear in them stopped him cold. "Please don't shoot," she whispered, her voice cracking from exhaustion. "I will do whatever you want, just don't kill me." Her words struck him with a sudden heaviness. She wasn't lying. She wasn't acting, and she wasn't trying to trick him. Everything about her, her shaking fingers, her shallow breaths, the way she tried to make herself smaller, told him she had been running from something far worse than anything he represented. Braden lowered the revolver slowly, making sure she could see his movements. He didn't step closer, not wanting to add to her fear. He had seen desperate people before, but this woman's terror was rooted in something deeper. Whoever had hurt her had shattered her sense of safety so completely she believed any cowboy on the trail was capable of killing her. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. She swallowed hard before answering. "Tahia." Braden holstered the revolver and took a moment to read her condition. Her breathing was unstable. Her lips were cracked. Her dress was torn in several places. Her moccasins were worn thin at the toes, and the fringe along her sides was coated with dirt. She looked ready to collapse. He reached up to the saddle and pulled off his coat. When he stepped toward her, she flinched, but she didn't run. She couldn't. Her strength was nearly gone. Braden set the coat around her shoulders gently, making sure not to touch her skin. The fabric almost swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it tight as if it were the first warmth she had felt in days. "You're freezing," he said. "You can't stay out here." She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed but aware that she didn't have another option. Her eyes darted to his holster, checking if he still held a threat. Seeing the empty hand calmed her just a little. Braden offered her his hand, expecting her to hesitate. She stared at it, unsure, then reached out with trembling fingers. When their hands touched, he felt how cold she truly was. She tried to stand but stumbled immediately, her legs giving out. Braden caught her arm before she hit the ground, lifting her upright with a firm but careful grip. She looked shocked by the gentle way he steadied her. "No one's going to hurt you," he said, trying not to push too much comfort into the words. He had learned that trust couldn't be forced. He led her to his horse, giving her time to adjust. Each step was slow, and each time her legs wobbled, he steadied her without pulling or tightening his hold. Once they reached the horse, she hesitated again, looking at him for direction. "Can you ride?" Braden asked. She nodded weakly, and he helped her into the saddle. Her fingers closed around the horn with desperate strength, and her shoulders tensed when he mounted behind her. Braden kept space between them, guiding the reins while avoiding any unnecessary contact. Even so, he felt her stiffen each time the horse shifted. They rode in silence. The land stretched empty around them, the sky gradually turning deeper blue as night approached. Braden kept glancing at Tahia, noting how her head dipped forward, how she fought to stay awake, how her hands tightened around the coat, as if afraid he might change his mind and leave her somewhere. The trail eventually opened to a clearing where his cabin stood, a small wooden structure with a single lantern glowing in the window. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm light spilling through the cracks offered a striking contrast to the cold outside. Tahia stared at it with a mixture of worry and disbelief, unsure if safety existed behind its walls or if the nightmare would continue in another form. Braden dismounted first. He stepped close enough to help her, but stayed far enough to avoid crowding her. She accepted his hand again, sliding off the horse carefully. When her feet hit the ground, her knees shook, and he steadied her by lightly supporting her elbow. "This is my place," he said, pushing open the door. "You can rest here." She walked inside slowly, eyes scanning the room. The bed in the corner, the table with 2 chairs, the rifle on the wall, the lantern casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. Everything looked unfamiliar, and she seemed afraid to make a wrong move. Braden set his gun on the table and moved to the shelf where he kept the water jug. He filled a tin cup and placed it within her reach. She stared at the cup for a moment before taking it with both hands. She drank quickly, water dribbling down her chin and soaking into the collar of the coat. When she lowered the cup, her breathing steadied, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked at his face instead of his hands. He saw exhaustion, fear, and a small, uncertain hope. Braden didn't speak. He didn't move closer. He gave her space, letting her decide what came next. Tahia stood there wrapped in his coat, the torn deerskin dress visible underneath, the firelight catching the small beads still attached to the fabric. She watched him with a mixture of caution and gratitude, trying to understand why a man with a gun and a quiet stare had chosen not to use either against her. In the warm stillness of the cabin, something shifted between them, a fragile understanding born not from words but from the simple fact that she was alive, and he had helped her stay that way. For the first time in days, she didn't feel hunted, and Braden, standing across the room, understood that his life had just changed in a way he hadn't expected when he left town that morning. Nothing needed to be said. The silence between them was enough. Tahia stood just inside the doorway, still wrapped in Braden's coat, her breathing slow and uneven as she tried to understand the space she had stepped into. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, warming the cabin with a steady glow that pushed back the cold creeping in from the night. She didn't walk farther. She seemed unsure she was allowed to sit, lie down, speak, or even breathe too loudly. Braden noticed every detail, her tense shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the coat, the slight shaking in her legs, and he understood she needed direction without being ordered. He moved his saddlebags to the side, giving her a clear path. "You can sit," he said quietly, nodding toward the chair near the hearth. She hesitated, glancing at the bed as though confused about where he expected her to go. When she realized he meant the chair, she took slow steps forward, lowering herself carefully as if afraid the legs might collapse under her weight. Braden added a small log to the fire, giving her more warmth, then set the kettle on the stove to heat water. Several questions had been left hanging after the first night. Questions that demanded answers if she was going to stay alive. He needed to know who was hunting her, how close they were, and what they intended. But he also saw how close she was to breaking. Asking too soon might only push her deeper into fear. So he focused on small, simple tasks that could give her time to breathe. Tahia watched him with guarded eyes, trying to predict his next move. She had expected rough hands, harsh commands, or the kind of violence she had run from. Instead, he moved around the cabin with calm, deliberate motions, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel trapped. He lit another lantern, placed it on the table, and wiped the dust from his hands. Only then did he turn toward her. "Did you eat anything today?" he asked. She shook her head, eyes lowering. Her voice came out faint. "Nothing since the river." That detail, the river, gave Braden the first missing piece. The nearest river lay 2 miles south. If she had crossed it, the bounty riders couldn't be far behind. He didn't show his concern, but his shoulders tightened slightly as he walked to the shelf and pulled down a small sack of bread. He cut a piece, placed it on a plate, and set it gently on the table before sliding it toward her. Tahia stared at the bread like she wasn't sure it was meant for her. When she picked it up, her hands trembled, but she ate with controlled bites, trying not to look desperate, even though every movement betrayed her hunger. Braden poured warm water into a tin cup and placed it beside her. She drank slowly this time, forcing herself to remain composed. As she ate, Braden studied her condition more closely. Her wrists had dark bands where bindings had dug into the skin. Her shoulders held scrapes that looked fresh, not older than a day. Her moccasins were torn along the edges, as if she had run through the thick brush at full speed. The most alarming thing, however, was the haunted look in her eyes, the look of someone who expected danger to burst through the door at any moment. After she finished the bread, she lifted her head, attempting to speak but stopping halfway. When she finally forced the words out, they carried a mixture of fear and shame. "Why did you help me? You do not know me." Braden leaned against the table, arms folded loosely. He didn't want to overwhelm her with long explanations. "You were hurt," he said. "I wasn't going to leave you out there." Her brows pulled together. "Most men would have." "I'm not most men," he replied simply. The room settled into quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It no longer felt dangerous. It felt cautious, unfamiliar, and slowly shifting toward something fragile. Tahia pulled the coat tighter around her chest, covering the torn neckline of her dress. She seemed embarrassed by the damage, as though it said something about her worth. Braden noticed her discomfort and turned toward the small trunk near his bed. Inside were old shirts he no longer used. He chose one that looked clean and held it out to her without stepping too close. "This will cover you better." Her eyes widened slightly, surprised by the gesture. She took the shirt with careful fingers, holding it against the torn fabric of her dress. For a moment, she didn't move, unsure if he expected her to change in front of him. When she looked at him questioningly, he understood her worry immediately. "I'll step outside," he said, reaching for his coat. "Take your time." Her relief was immediate but quiet. She nodded as he opened the door and stepped into the cold air. The wind had picked up again, sweeping across the clearing with a low rustle that stirred the brush near the fence. Braden scanned the darkness, checking for movement near the tree line. Nothing shifted. No horses, no voices, no lanterns. But he knew that didn't mean they were safe. The men chasing her wouldn't give up easily. He remained outside long enough to make sure she finished without rushing. When he finally returned, she was standing near the fire, wearing his shirt over her dress, the coat still draped over her shoulders. Her hair fell loosely from the braid now, dark strands catching the lantern's glow. She looked cleaner somehow, not physically, but emotionally, like the few minutes alone had given her space to gather herself. She watched him closely as he closed the door, but the fear in her gaze had softened slightly. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly, misunderstanding his pause. "I didn't expect you to," he answered. Braden hung his coat back on the hook and moved to the table. There were still unanswered questions, and avoiding them would only make things harder later. He kept his voice even, avoiding anything that might sound like interrogation. "What happened?" he asked. Tahia hesitated, but he waited without pushing. She sat down again, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice came out unsteady but clear. "3 men took me from my village. They sold me to riders who said I was worth more if taken alive." She swallowed hard. "They wanted to bring me north. I escaped near the river." Braden processed the details carefully. If 3 riders had been paid to bring her north, someone with money wanted her. Someone dangerous. Someone who wouldn't accept failure. "Did they see which way you ran?" he asked. "I don't know. I heard them shouting. I ran until my legs gave out." She looked down at the floor, shame flickering across her expression. "I thought you were one of them." Her honesty struck him with a surprising weight. He understood now why she had begged the way she did, why her first instinct had been to kneel rather than fight. "You're safe here," he said. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." She looked up slowly, searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, her shoulders loosened just a fraction. "What about you?" she asked softly. "Why are you alone out here?" Braden didn't expect the question, but he didn't avoid it. "My brother died in a raid. After that, I stayed on the land. Kept to myself. It's simpler that way." Tahia studied him with a quiet seriousness, as if trying to understand the kind of grief that pushed a man into years of solitude. For the first time, she felt something other than fear. She felt a small pull of empathy toward the quiet cowboy who had helped her with no promise of reward. The fire crackled between them, filling the room with steady warmth. She pulled his coat tighter again, and her voice softened. "Thank you for not being like them." Braden didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The silence between them held a new shape now. Still cautious, still delicate, but carrying the first hints of trust. Outside, the night deepened, and a distant sound echoed across the land. Too faint to name, but enough to stiffen Braden's posture for a moment. Trouble wasn't gone. It was only delayed. Inside the cabin, however, for the first time since her escape, Tahia felt the smallest thread of safety begin to form. And Braden, watching her from across the room, understood that whatever danger followed her had now become part of his world too. The fire burned low, leaving a warm orange glow spreading across the wooden floorboards while the night outside pressed against the cabin walls. Tahia sat quietly at the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly around the sleeves of the coat Braden had given her. She had eaten, drunk water, cleaned her face, and changed into a shirt, yet a faint tremor still moved through her shoulders. Braden noticed the small details, the way her eyes drifted toward the window whenever the wind shifted, the way she flinched at distant sounds, the way her posture tightened whenever he stepped too close. She wasn't simply afraid of the riders. She was afraid of being claimed again. Braden added another log to the fire, giving her more warmth, and then moved to the table where his rifle lay across a folded blanket. He checked the chamber with slow, steady movements. He didn't want her thinking he was preparing for something violent inside the cabin, so he kept his back angled toward her, letting her see every deliberate motion. When he finished, he leaned a rifle against the wall, but within reach. Tahia finally broke the silence, her voice low and strained. "Will they find this place?" Braden faced her fully, answering without hesitation. "Not tonight." He didn't say never. She was smart enough to hear the truth he didn't speak. The tension in her face eased just enough for a deeper breath. She looked away from the window and studied the cabin more closely, taking in things she hadn't noticed before. The second chair with worn edges, the half-repaired window frame near the corner, the boots tucked neatly under the bed, the small wooden carving on the shelf shaped like a horse. Each detail gave her a small glimpse into the kind of man he was, and she tried to fit those pieces together. Why do you live so far from town? She asked quietly. Braden rested his hands on the edge of the table. He rarely talked about himself, but she deserved to know more than simple answers. I didn't want the noise. People talk too much. Out here I can work, sleep, and keep things simple. Doesn't it get lonely? She asked, genuinely curious. It used to, he admitted. Not so much anymore. She lowered her gaze, unsure what he meant, unsure if she wanted to assume anything. But the tone of his voice held no pressure, just honesty. Outside, the wind brushed across the roof again, faint but steady. Braden crossed to the door, lifted the latch, and stepped out for a moment to check the clearing. The sky was dark except for a slice of moon that cast faint light across the brush. He scanned the tree line, listening for hooves or voices. Everything remained still. When he stepped back inside, Tahia was watching him intently, reading his expression for danger. Nothing out there, he said. Her shoulders dropped a little, but exhaustion pulled at her features. Fear had burned through her strength earlier, and now that she was warmer and fed, her body struggled to stay upright. Braden noticed the way her eyelids dipped, then lifted again quickly as if she thought falling asleep would be dangerous. You can rest, he said. You're safe in here. She hesitated, looking at the bed. The surface was covered with a thick blanket and a pillow that still carried the faint shape of where he usually slept. She pressed her lips together. Where will you sleep? I'll take the chair, he replied, nodding toward the one near the stove. It's fine. You don't have to give up your place, she whispered. You need it more. Her eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen before, not just grateful, but touched by the simple kindness. She walked over to the bed slowly, her steps unsteady but measured. When she reached it, she placed one hand on the blanket, testing it as though expecting something hidden beneath. Finding nothing but warmth, she sat carefully and lowered her head. Braden grabbed an old quill from the trunk and draped it over the chair before sitting down. He watched the fire, giving her privacy to settle. For a while, the only sound was the quiet crackling of burning wood. Tahia lay down slowly, pulling the blanket to her chin. She tried to stay awake, fighting the urge to drift off, but her body finally betrayed her. Her breathing deepened, shoulders relaxed, and one hand slipped out from beneath the blanket. Braden let his eyes close for a moment, but he remained alert. He wasn't used to sharing the cabin with anyone, especially someone being hunted. Every sound mattered, every shift of the wind, every creak in the frame. He stayed awake longer than he expected, scanning the window each time the night made a new noise. What Braden didn't expect was the faint sound that made him sit up straight, a quiet choke breath followed by another. He stood from the chair immediately, thinking she was in pain. When he reached the bedside, he realized the truth. She was dreaming. Her mouth moved without sound, her fingers digging into the blanket, her brow pulled tight. She looked trapped, cornered, and terrified even in sleep. Braden knelt beside the bed, not touching her, but close enough to speak softly. You're safe. Nobody's here. Her breathing slowed. Her hands relaxed. Her dream loosened its grip on her. She didn't wake, but the tension faded from her face. Braden stayed there for a long moment. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected to care this quickly. Hadn't expected her presence to stir something he'd buried years ago. But watching her struggle, even in sleep, struck something inside him he didn't know how to name. When he finally returned to the chair, the firelight caught the faint bruise along her collarbone where someone had grabbed her earlier. His jaw tightened, and he felt a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't helping her out of duty. He was helping her because she deserved a chance to live without fear. Because no one should sleep like that. The night grew colder as hours passed, but the cabin remained warm. Tahia slept without waking, and Braden stayed awake, guarding the door, the window, and the fragile sense of safety they'd built in a single night. Just before dawn, a distant sound echoed across the land, a faint crunch of something moving through brush. Braden turned his head sharply, listening. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, someone getting closer. The quiet morning had brought with it the first sign that Tahia's past was not done searching for her. The first light of dawn crept across the floorboards in a thin, pale line, but the air inside the cabin held the tension left over from the sound Braden had heard before sunrise. He remained by the window, shoulders still, eyes fixed on the brush near the tree line. For several minutes, nothing moved, but he trusted his instincts more than the quiet. Whoever was out there had paused, not vanished. Behind him, Tahia shifted on the bed, waking slowly. Her eyes opened to the faint morning glow, and her breathing caught when she saw Braden standing rigid near the wall. She pushed herself up on her elbows, worry spreading across her face. "What's wrong?" Braden didn't turn fully, keeping his attention on the land outside. "I heard someone near the clearing before sunup." He kept his voice low, steady, to avoid sparking panic. "Could be nothing. Could be a scout checking the area." Tahia sat up, both hands gripping the blanket. The calm she'd gained overnight evaporated. "They're looking for me." She didn't say it with fear alone. She said it with certainty. Braden faced her, evaluating her reaction, her readiness, her strength. He needed answers he had avoided last night. Answers that could clarify what level of danger was approaching. "These men," he said quietly, "what exactly were they hired to do?" Tahia lowered her gaze. Her fingers tightened around the blanket, as though confessing it would hurt. "They were ordered to take me to a ranch in the north," she said softly. "A man there paid for women captured from Apache lands. Some were kept alive. Some weren't." Braden felt heat rise behind his ribs, controlled but sharp. He had heard rumors about men like that. Private buyers who worked outside the law, men who paid well to avoid questions. He understood now why she had run with such desperation, why she had expected him to hurt her the moment they met. "Did they say why this man wanted you?" he asked. She took a slow breath, gathering the courage to speak. He wanted women who could work the house and the fields, and others he wanted for himself. Her voice grew thin. "They said I would fetch a high price." The pieces fit together in Braden's mind, too neatly, too predictably. Wealthy buyers, riders hired to deliver people like cargo, lawmen looking the other way if enough money passed hands. He knew that if those men reached his door, they wouldn't accept a simple refusal. "We need to move carefully," he said, stepping closer but stopping far enough to respect her space. If they circled near the clearing, they might be checking every trail. He pointed toward the south-facing window. "There's a ridge behind the cabin. Anyone coming from the west will have to pass it. I can see them before they see us." Tahia pulled the blanket aside and stood, still wearing his shirt layered over her torn dress. She steadied herself on the edge of the bed before walking toward him. Her steps were slow but determined. "I won't bring danger to your home," she said insistently. "If they come, I will go outside and let them take me. You don't owe me anything." Braden turned to her, expression firm. "You're not doing that. Not after what you told me. You don't understand," she whispered, frustration and guilt tightening her voice. "They will kill you if you try to stop them." "I've dealt with men who think they can take whatever they want," he answered, his tone controlled but edged with steel. "I'm not letting them touch you." She stared at him, shocked by the conviction in his words. The man she had thought was a stranger hours ago now stood between her and danger without hesitation. The fear in her expression wavered, replaced by something new, cautious trust. Braden gestured toward the stove. "You should eat. You'll need your strength." Tahia nodded and moved toward the table, her fingers brushing the back of the chair before she sat. Braden handed her a piece of bread and a small tin cup of warm water. She ate slowly, trying to steady her breathing. Her eyes drifted occasionally to the window, tracking the shadows outside. Braden checked the door latch, then pulled his rifle from the wall. He inspected the barrel, making sure it was clean, then loaded 3 fresh rounds. Tahia watched him, anxiety rising again. "Will you fight them if they come?" "I'll protect this cabin," he said, "whatever that requires." He walked to the back door, the one that opened toward the ridge, and stepped onto the small porch. Tahia followed him a few steps, stopping at the threshold. The morning air carried a sharp chill, but there was something else, an unusual stillness, as if the land itself waited. Braden scanned the tree line, then crouched to examine the ground. A faint set of tracks marked the dirt. horse prints moving in a slow, circling pattern. Someone had ridden near the property, close enough to inspect, but far enough to avoid detection. Tahiya's voice trembled behind him. "Are they coming back?" "Most likely," he said. "They were scouting." The truth sank into her slowly. She sank to her knees on the porch, pressing her hands against the wooden floor to keep herself from shaking. "I thought I escaped," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I got away." Braden knelt beside her, not touching, but close enough for her to feel grounded. "You did. They're only looking because they failed, and they'll keep failing." She lifted her head, searching his expression for lies. But Braden didn't lie. Everything about his posture, his voice, his eyes told her he meant every word. A sudden gust of wind pushed through the clearing, carrying a faint metallic jingle, like a horse's bridle shifting in the distance. Braden stiffened, standing quickly. Tahiya stood with him, gripping the doorframe to steady her shaking legs. "Someone's out there," she said faintly. He backed her inside with a steady hand hovering near her elbow. "Stay away from the windows," he instructed calmly. "Get behind the table." She obeyed, crouching low behind the oak surface. Her breathing quickened as Braden moved to the window beside the stove and looked out from the corner. A lone rider emerged between two tall pines, moving slowly along the edge of the ridge. He wasn't charging or approaching directly. He was scanning the land. Searching. Braden raised a rifle slightly, but did not aim yet. Tahiya peeked from behind the table, her heart pounding. She whispered, "That is one of them." Braden's jaw tightened, and he lowered the curtain just enough to keep from being seen. "He's headed north, probably checking the river trail." "How many do you think there are?" she asked, voice unsteady. "At least 3, Braden answered. "But there could be more traveling behind." She swallowed hard, dread settling deep inside her. Braden stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "You're not facing them alone. I need you to believe that." She held his gaze, feeling his determination press through her panic. She nodded slowly, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. Not from fear alone, but from the realization that someone was choosing to stand beside her. The rider disappeared over the ridge, leaving the clearing quiet again. But the silence carried a truth they could no longer ignore. The hunt had reached Red Mesa Crossing, and the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming the first line of a battle neither of them had asked for. Yet both knew they would face it together. The ridge remained quiet long after the lone rider vanished, but the air inside the cabin carried a thick, unspoken tension neither of them could ignore. Braden kept his rifle close while Tahiya stayed low behind the table, her fingers curled tightly around the edge as she tried to steady her breathing. The morning sun finally pushed through the clouds, casting a pale light across the floor that made every movement outside more visible. Braden watched the line of trees for several minutes before lowering the curtain again. When he stepped away from the window, Tahiya rose slowly, her knees stiff from crouching. She approached him carefully, searching his face for any hint of reassurance. "Do you think more of them will come?" "Yes," he said plainly. Braden didn't soften the truth. She deserved clarity, not false comfort. They won't leave the valley until they're sure they've covered every trail. Tahiya exhaled quietly, her shoulders dropping. She pressed a hand against the side of her neck, trying to ease the tight, not forming there. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say," Braden answered. "Could be hours. Could be until nightfall. Depends how far behind the others are." Her eyes flicked to the door, then to the windows, as though calculating every possible escape route. He noticed the panic building again and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're safe in here for now. The ridge gives us cover, and the cabin's too small to hide more than one person. They won't expect anyone inside besides me." She looked up sharply. "They know you're alone?" "Most men know how long I've lived out here," he replied. "People watch more than they talk." That explanation filled a gap she had been quietly worrying about. How much the riders might already know about him, how much danger he had walked into simply by offering her shelter. Her face softened with guilt. "You should have let me keep moving. They wouldn't be looking for you." Braden shook his head once. "I'm not letting you walk back into their hands." She opened her mouth to argue again, But his expression made her stop. Braden wasn't someone to be swayed by fear. Not his, not hers. She understood that now. To steady her hands, she pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and sat at the table. Braden moved to the small shelf where he kept a single iron pot and filled it with water. He added a handful of dried beans he'd planned to use later in the week. She watched him quietly, noticing the simplicity of his routine, the way he filled silence with small tasks, the careful precision he used when handling anything fragile or sharp. When he set the pot on the stove, she finally voiced the question that had been stuck in her mind since the night before. "How did you know I wasn't going to harm you?" Braden leaned back against the counter, folding his arms loosely. "I've seen dangerous people," he answered. "You didn't move like someone looking for a weapon. You moved like someone trying not to be found." She absorbed his words, surprised by how accurately he'd read her. "You trust your instincts that much?" "They've kept me alive," he said. The beans began to simmer, filling the cabin with a warm, earthy scent. Tahia sat still, letting the smell settle her nerves. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and though she didn't say it, Braden knew she needed something heavier than bread. He grabbed a tin of salt and a dried herb mixture from a small wooden box, adding them to the pot before lowering the heat. Another question surfaced in Tahia's mind, one she had been unsure she could ask. "The man who bought women, do you know who he is? Have you heard his name?" Braden thought for a moment. He rarely involved himself in town gossip, but information traveled fast in isolated places. "There's a rancher up north," he said finally. "Wealthy, buys land every season, hires different crews each month so no one gets too familiar with his business. People say he moves cattle. Others say he moves people." The color drained from Tahia's cheeks. "That's him." Braden nodded once, confirming her fear. "Then these riders aren't just hired hands. They're men who do anything for money." She wrapped her arms around herself, a quiet shiver passing through her. "If they find out you helped me, they won't stop with me. They'll come after you too." "Let them try," Braden said. His tone wasn't loud or threatening. It was simply a statement, a quiet acceptance of whatever might come. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a different sound this time. Distant hoofbeats, faint enough to be miles away but strong enough to be unmistakable. Tahia froze. Braden stepped toward the front window and lifted the corner of the curtain just slightly. The ridge remained empty, but the sound grew clearer, echoing through the valley. "They're spreading out," Braden said, checking every direction. Tahia's pulse quickened. "Do we run?" "No," he said immediately. "Running in daylight puts you right in their path." "Then what do we do?" Her voice shook despite her effort to stay steady. "We hide what's yours," Braden said, scanning the cabin. "Your dress, your moccasins, anything they might recognize." She grabbed the torn deerskin dress from the bed, clutched it to her chest, and handed it to him. He opened the trap door beneath the stove, a small storage space built into the ground, and placed the dress inside. She removed the leather ties from her braids and gave them to him as well, then exchanged her moccasins for an old pair of socks he handed her. When everything was hidden, Braden closed the trap door quietly. Tahia stood barefoot on the wooden floor, his oversized shirt hanging down to her thighs, the coat draped around her shoulders. Without her traditional clothing, she looked like she belonged inside the cabin, not like someone being hunted across the valley. It wasn't a solution, but it narrowed the risks. The hoofbeats faded again, leaving a heavy silence. Braden turned to her. "They're not coming here yet. They're testing the land first. That gives us time." She stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why go this far for someone you just met?" Braden held her gaze for a moment, his voice low but steady. "Because you were alone out there. Because you were hurt. Because nobody should be taken like that." Her breath caught. She lowered her head for a moment, trying to hide the sudden emotion rising in her chest. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe me anything," he said. She lifted her eyes again, and for the first time since the night he found her, something softer broke through the layers of fear, a fragile trust that hadn't existed until now. Braden returned to the stove to stir the pot, giving her space. She watched him with a steadier expression, absorbing every detail, his quietness, his restraint, the way he positioned himself near the door without making a show of guarding it. Everything about him contradicted the world she had escaped. She stood from the table and walked closer to him, stopping at a distance respectful enough to keep the air between them comfortable. "If they come," she said in a trembling whisper, "I'll do what you say." Braden met her eyes with a calm intensity. "Then we'll get through this." He didn't promise safety. He promised a fight. And for the first time since her escape, Tahia believed she wasn't facing it alone. The sky shifted from pale morning to a muted gray as clouds gathered over Red Mesa Crossing, covering the land in a dim, uneasy stillness. Braden stood near the stove, stirring the pot, while listening for every small noise outside. Tahia sat beside the table, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't tremble now, but her alertness was razor-sharp, the kind born from too many close calls. The hoofbeats from earlier still echoed in her mind, a reminder that danger had simply paused, not vanished. Braden lifted the pot from a stove and served her a bowl of warm beans. He didn't speak while placing the food before her. He simply stepped back to give her room. She took the bowl with careful fingers and ate slowly, appreciating the warmth more than the taste. She watched him from across the table, noticing every detail of his movements. The way he kept glancing toward the windows, the way he positioned himself between her and the front door without making it obvious. After several quiet minutes, she finally asked the question that had been weighing on her since dawn. "If they come here in daylight, what will you do?" Braden paused in the middle of setting down his own bowl. He answered with blunt honesty. "Depend what they try." Tahia swallowed, nodding slowly. "Those riders, they do not talk first. They take. They don't care who they kill." He leaned on the back of the chair, studying her expression. "They won't get that chance here." Her gaze dropped to the bowl, troubled by more than fear alone. "They know I escaped near the river," she murmured. "They'll check water sources first. They'll follow the ground. They aren't foolish." Braden took that in, realizing she hadn't mentioned the abilities of the riders, how they tracked, how they hunted, until now. "How far can they track you?" he asked. "All the way to wherever they're paid to deliver," she replied. "They follow broken plants, footprints, scraps of fabric. If they saw you leading me away, they'll think I'm inside this valley." That clarified something he'd been wondering, how skilled the men were, and how much risk he'd taken bringing her here. Braden straightened, stepping toward the door. "I'll check the back again. Stay behind the table." She set down the bowl and stood immediately. "I'm coming with you." "Tahia, I'm not hiding while you watch alone," she said, voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He didn't argue further. She walked behind him toward the back door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He opened the door slowly, letting the colder air wash in. Tahia stepped to his right, staying slightly behind him but close enough to see past him. The ridge stretched outward, quiet and undisturbed. No movement, no sound, but the ground told the truth. Braden crouched near the steps and wiped away dirt to reveal a clearer set of tracks, fresh, shallow, and moving in a circular pattern around the clearing, more distinct than the ones from earlier. Tahia knelt beside him, gripping her coat with both hands. "There is more than one horse," she whispered. "Three," Braden confirmed. Two came together, one closer to the rocks. Her pulse jumped. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. They're watching the land. They're waiting for movement. Braden stood, jaw tightening. "Then we give them none." He led her back inside and shut the door quietly. He checked the latch twice, then moved to the front window. Tahia stepped to the stove and poured both of them more warm water, needing a task to steady her nerves. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed. Her breath caught at the unexpected warmth of his hand, but she didn't pull away immediately. He held her gaze for a moment before taking the cup gently. The small contact grounded her more than food or warmth had. She returned to her seat while Braden studied the land outside. After several minutes, she spoke again, this time with a different tone, quiet but carrying something deeper. "Braden, why do you live this far from people?" He didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of water, then set the cup down. "Because noise makes my head worse," he said. Because I failed to protect someone I loved. Because empty land doesn't ask questions. She absorbed the words, understanding more about him than he'd ever spoken aloud. Your brother? He nodded once. I wasn't there when he needed me. Haven't been good around crowds since. Tahia let out a slow breath. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said. You didn't cause it. Still, something in his voice made her chest tighten. She leaned forward slightly. You saved me, she said softly. Maybe that matters. For the first time that morning, something subtle shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not relief, but a quiet flicker of recognition. He lifted his eyes fully to meet hers, seeing not a frightened runaway, but a woman fighting to reclaim her life. Before either of them could speak again, a new sound rolled across the valley, faint, metallic, uneven. A gate somewhere in the distance clanged shut. Not wind, not an animal, metal hitting metal. Braden crossed the room in 3 long steps and pressed his shoulder to the wall, near the window, peeking out through the narrow gap between the curtain and the frame. He froze. 2 horses were tied near the base of the ridge, not moving, waiting. Tahia approached slowly, fear rising again. What do you see? She whispered. He kept his eyes on the ridge. They're not riding anymore. They've stopped. They're searching on foot. Her breath shook. They're coming this way. Not straight toward the cabin yet, he said. They're checking each slope. A heavy silence settled between them. Tense, tight, immediate. Tahia's hand rose to her throat, fingers trembling. If they come close, they'll see tracks from yesterday. They'll know someone else is here. Braden stepped away from the window and opened the small trunk beside the bed. Inside was a folded wool blanket and an old length of rope. He pulled them both out. If they get within sight of the porch, you go into the cellar. Her eyes widened. No, I won't leave you. This isn't a choice, he said, voice calm but unyielding. If they see 2 people, they'll attack. If they see me alone, they might talk before shooting. She shook her head fiercely. Those men won't talk to you. They won't listen. Braden stepped closer, lowering himself enough to meet her eyes directly. I'm not letting them take you, he said quietly. But I need you alive if something goes wrong. Her throat tightened. Emotion surged behind her eyes. Not fear, not panic, but something heavy and rooted. The fear of losing the one person who had treated her like a human being. Braden, she whispered, I can't hide while you fight for me. He didn't look away. You can, and you will. She closed her eyes, torn between fear and loyalty. When she opened them, her voice trembled with a new kind of strength. If you fall, I won't survive out there. I'm not falling, he said, steady as stone. She stepped closer until the coat brushed his chest. Her hands rose to his shirt, gripping the fabric lightly. Please be careful. His breath slowed. He didn't touch her, but the closeness struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He saw in her expression something raw, an attachment forming in the middle of danger, rooted in trust she hadn't intended to give. He held her gaze for a long moment, then stepped back gently. Stay ready. A shout echoed faintly from the ridge, low, distant, but unmistakable. A rider had spotted something. Braden moved to the door, rifle raised, shoulders squared. Tahia backed toward the cellar door, her breath shaking. Danger had arrived on foot, and the cabin was no longer a hiding place. It was about to become the line they would both have to defend. The shout from a ridge carried through the cold morning air like a warning neither of them could ignore. Braden tightened his grip on the rifle while the cabin seemed to shrink around them, every board and nail suddenly feeling too thin to keep trouble out. Tahia moved toward the cellar door with slow steps, her fingers brushing the wooden handle as she prepared herself to descend if he gave the signal. Her breathing stayed quiet, but fear tightened her shoulders. Braden crossed the room and lowered his voice. You stay down there until I say otherwise. No matter what you hear. She took the bowl with careful fingers and ate slowly, appreciating the warmth more than the taste. She watched him from across the table, noticing every detail of his movements. The way he kept glancing toward the windows, the way he positioned himself between her and the front door without making it obvious. After several quiet minutes, She finally asked the question that had been weighing on her since dawn. If they come here in daylight, what will you do? Braden paused in the middle of setting down his own bowl. He answered with blunt honesty. Depend what they try. Tahia swallowed, nodding slowly. Those riders, they do not talk first. They take. He's one who held the rope yesterday. Braden's jaw tightened. Then he won't leave quietly. He stepped away from the window and pointed toward the cellar. Go. She didn't move. Her hand stayed frozen on the cellar handle. Braden, if something happens, nothing will. He cut in, firm but not harsh. I need you alive, Tahia. If they see you in this cabin, they'll fire without talking. She finally opened the cellar door, but turned back before climbing down. The uncertainty in her eyes held something deeper than fear, something that asked if he truly wanted to stand alone in this. Braden stepped closer, lowering his rifle slightly. You're not leaving me, he said, sensing the fear beneath her hesitation. You're protecting yourself so I can do what I need to. Her throat tightened. Promise me you won't walk outside. I'm not stepping into open ground, he said. I'll make them come to the porch if they want to fight. A brief, trembling breath escaped her, and she descended into the cellar, pulling the wooden door shut above her. Braden placed a small iron latch through the handle, not to trap her, but to keep the door from rattling if she panicked. He returned to the window. The first rider reached the bottom of the ridge, crouched low and scanning the brush. A second rider appeared behind him, holding a coil of rope that swung with each step. The rope detail answered a question Braden had been avoiding: why they wanted her alive. They weren't sent to kill. They were sent to deliver. Braden steadied his rifle against the corner of the window frame. He didn't aim at them yet. He simply studied their formation, learning how they moved. The third rider emerged moments later, carrying a pistol and glancing toward the treeline. When he lifted his head, Braden recognized the look in his eyes. Confidence mixed with impatience, the expression of a man who believed nothing could stand in his way. The men spread out, forming a loose semicircle as they searched for movement. One lifted his chin toward the clearing where the cabin sat. Braden felt a sharp tension pull through him. They were close enough to see the cabin roof now. He set the rifle down long enough to move toward the back wall, checking the ground through the shadows near the entry path. No marks of recent movement except their own. That gave him a sliver of advantage. No tracks leading to the cabin would reveal Tahia. He heard the first clear voice, then gruff, irritated, and searching. Tracks end here. Someone passed through last night. Braden's chest tightened. Tahia's weak steps from the night before had left faint impressions in the dust. He hadn't erased them because he hadn't expected the men to reach the ridge this soon. Another voice answered, quieter but colder. She wouldn't survive long alone. Someone must have taken her in. That cabin? The third rider asked, his tone almost amused. Braden adjusted his stance near the window, keeping himself hidden behind the wooden support beam. His heart remained steady, his breathing measured. He had faced armed men before, but never with someone depending on him from beneath the floorboards. Boots crunched closer. The second rider stepped into view, pointing toward the clearing. Smoke from a chimney. Someone's inside. Braden lifted his rifle slowly and set his feet firmly on the floor. When the men emerged fully from the treeline, their weapons hung low at their sides, not drawn, but ready. The first man raised a hand, signaling the others to spread wider across the yard. Their boots scraped across the dirt as they approached, stopping only when they were about 15 yards from the porch. The leader cupped a hand around his mouth. Cabin. We're looking for a woman who escaped near the river. Apache. Young. Hurt. You see her? Braden didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. Come on out, the leader added. Ain't here to fight a stranger. Braden stepped forward just enough to be seen through the window, but stayed behind the frame. I don't know anyone by that description, he said calmly. The leader squinted. Mind if we take a look around? Yes, Braden said. A pause. You hiding something? The leader asked. Only thing I have is trouble when strangers ask to snoop around my land. The second rider took a step forward. We ain't leaving without her. So you can make this easy, or... Braden raised the rifle enough to end the sentence. The men tensed immediately. The leader lifted a hand, signaling the others to hold still. Listen, she's worth money. A lot of money. Not for you, for the man we ride for. He'll pay well if you hand her over. Braden kept his voice even. Not interested. The leader smirked. You should be. Some folks like to pick up strays. Then they realize it's better to trade while the price is high. Braden's grip tightened, and then the leader made a mistake. He stepped closer. Braden's voice dropped to a tone far sharper than before. Stop right there. The rider froze, caught off guard by the force behind the words. Braden wasn't threatening for effect. He meant every syllable. The third rider scanned the cabin again. If she's inside, you'll regret protecting her. Braden didn't blink. If she's inside, you won't reach the porch alive. The threat landed. The leader's jaw stiffened. You'd shoot over a woman you barely know? Braden answered with absolute clarity. I'd shoot over what's right. A silence stretched, thicker than before. The riders exchanged looks, reconsidering their approach. They weren't cowards, but they hadn't expected someone willing to stand his ground this firmly. When she opened them, her voice trembled with a new kind of strength. If you fall, I won't survive out there. I'm not falling, he said, steady as stone. She stepped closer until the coat brushed his chest. Her hands rose to his shirt, gripping the fabric lightly. Please be careful. His breath slowed. He didn't touch her, but the closeness struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He saw in her expression something raw, an attachment forming in the middle of danger, rooted in trust she hadn't intended to give. He held her gaze for a long moment, then stepped back gently. Stay ready. A shout echoed faintly from the ridge, low, distant, but unmistakable. A rider had spotted something. Her breath trembled as she looked up at him. In that moment, the danger outside made the space between them feel almost alive with urgency, fear, and something new, something fragile but undeniable. What do we do now? She asked. Braden set the rifle down gently. Now, he said, we prepare. The threat the riders left behind settled into the cabin like a heavy weight neither Braden nor Tahia could ignore. The sunlight drifted across the clearing in slow, thin lines, giving them several hours to prepare before darkness arrived. Braden checked every window, every latch, every blind spot, trying to predict where the riders might approach from once night fell. Tahia followed him quietly, studying the structure she had taken shelter in, learning the small vulnerabilities she hadn't noticed before. He pointed toward the back wall. If they try breaking in, that side's weaker than the others. Tahia examined the aged boards, nodding. Can we strengthen it? I've got spare planks outside. We'll use those. Her shoulders lifted slightly, not out of relief, but from a growing sense of purpose. Helping him build a defense steadied her more than hiding. Braden stepped onto the porch first, scanning the ridge again before motioning for her to join him. She kept close to the door, but didn't hesitate. He handed her one end of a plank, and together they moved it inside. As they worked, she finally voiced something that had been gnawing at her since the riders left. Why did they give a warning? That's not normal for them. Braden hammered a nail into the board, driving it firmly into place. Because they're not sure I'm alone. They're testing how far I'll go. They want to see if fear will do their work for them. Tahia swallowed, absorbing the explanation. They expect you to give in. They're mistaken, he said without looking up. She stepped back and observed him as he lifted another plank. The quiet determination in his movements made her chest tighten. He wasn't just fighting for her survival. He was choosing to stand in a storm he didn't ask for. That realization stirred something deep in her, an ache she didn't know how to name. They reinforced the back wall, checked the hinges on the doors, and secured the shutters until the inside felt like a shelter reinforced by willpower as much as wood. When they finished, Braden placed the hammer on the table and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. You did well, he said. Tahia lowered her gaze and used a praise. I've helped rebuild homes before. After raids. After fires. He paused, suddenly realizing he didn't know much about her life before the capture. Not the daily routines, the family she came from, or the dreams she'd lost. He leaned against the table, studying her expression. What was your life like? He asked gently. She hesitated, but he waited patiently. She wrapped her arms around herself as if holding the memories in place. My village was small, she began. We lived near the canyon. My mother made clothing. My father hunted. I gathered plants, helped tend fires. We had quiet days, simple days. Her voice wavered, the pain of the past brushing against every syllable. When the riders came, they burned everything. They took anyone strong enough to walk. Braden's jaw tightened. He understood the cruelty of men hired to do the work others didn't want to soil their hands with. But hearing her speak the truth added a weight that cut deeper than any rumor or assumption. Did your family survive? He asked softly. Tahia shook her head once, the motion small but absolute. No, I ran. I don't know what happened to the others. The grief in her voice was raw, but she didn't cry. Braden watched her silently, realizing that beneath her fear was a strength forged through loss he couldn't fully imagine. He approached her slowly, placing a hand just above her elbow, not pulling, not guiding, just offering solid presence. You're safe now, he said quietly. She inhaled shakily. I don't feel safe anywhere. I know, he replied, but you're not alone in it. Her throat tightened as she absorbed those words. A quiet warmth spread through her chest, an unfamiliar feeling that unsettled her more than fear because it carried the hint of hope. She looked up at him slowly, meeting his eyes with a clarity she hadn't shown before. Why do you trust me? She whispered. Braden didn't look away. Because the first thing you did when you saw me was beg to live. People who lie don't beg like that. She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. When she opened them again, something in her expression had shifted. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer anchored her. It now stood beside a growing attachment. Something fragile, something dangerous, something real. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, cutting through the quiet. Tahia stepped to the window and noticed clouds gathering heavily above the ridge. A storm is coming, she said. That might help us, Braden replied. Rain hides tracks, makes it harder for them to see. And harder for you, she added, worried. Braden moved closer, standing behind her, but keeping a respectful distance. I've seen worse storms, he said, but these riders won't wait long. The moment darkness hits, they'll move fast. She bit her lip, turning toward him with a new fear overtaking the old one. What if they set the cabin on fire? They did that to another home when a girl escaped. Braden took a slow breath, realizing she had withheld that detail earlier out of fear. They'd have to get close to do that, he said. And they won't. Not tonight. She pressed her hand to her chest again, wrestling with the memory. They laughed while it burned. They didn't even look back. Braden's expression hardened. They won't touch this place. Tahia studied him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. His resolve was so steady, so anchored, that she felt a strange confidence she hadn't felt since her village burned. She reached out impulsively and set her hand on his arm, leaving it there longer than she intended. Braden, if anything happens to you, nothing will, he interrupted, though his voice softened. But if something goes wrong, you head toward the canyon. Follow the shadows. Don't stop. Her fingers tightened on his arm. I won't leave you. He looked down at her hand, then back at her eyes. You may have to. Before she could answer, the wind shifted sharply, slamming against the side of the cabin with a hollow rustle. They both turned toward the sound. Braden stepped forward cautiously, listening as branches scraped across the roof. But it wasn't branches. A faint voice carried through the thickening wind, sharp, low, and too close to be mistaken. We'll wait out the storm here. Tahia's heart dropped. Braden stepped toward the window and peeked through the narrow crack. 3 shadows stood under the trees, riders taking shelter, watching the clearing, waiting for darkness. Tahia whispered, They're not leaving. No, Braden said, voice steady. They're settling in. The storm rolled in with steady thunder. The riders remained at the ridge, and night was approaching fast. Night settled over red, mesa crossing with a heaviness that made every sound cut through the dark like a blade. The storm gathered fully now, thick clouds rolling across the sky as thunder rumbled low against the ridge. Rain began as a soft patter, then grew into steady sheets, pounding the roof. Braden stood near the window, rifle ready, his breath slow and controlled. Tahia stayed close to the table, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for any sign of change. She didn't tremble anymore. Fear had shifted into something sharper, something anchored in the connection they'd built over the last day. Outside, the riders remained beneath the trees, shadows waiting for the storm to do their work. They believed rain would dampen Braden's aim, blind him in the dark, and mask their footsteps. They assumed this cabin held only one man. They assumed he would break. They were wrong. Braden motioned for Tahia. Downstairs. Now. She approached him instead, gripping his forearm. You don't have to face them alone, she said fiercely, her voice low but unshaking. I do, he answered. If they see you, they won't talk, they'll fire. Her hand tightened. And if they kill you, they won't. He cupped her elbow, not pulling her away, but steadying her. Please, go. She held his gaze a moment longer, searching for any hint of doubt. When she found none, she finally stepped back toward the cellar, but left the door cracked open just enough to listen. Braden moved to the front of the cabin and blew out 2 of the lanterns. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint glow of the fire behind the stove. He positioned himself near the window again and waited, watching the ridge through the slanted line of rain. Minutes passed with nothing but thunder and wind. Then movement. A faint glimmer of metal caught the corner of his eye, a pistol barrel shifting under the trees. The leader moved first, signaling the others to spread out. They advanced slowly, crouched low, believing the storm concealed them. Braden steadied his rifle against the wood frame. When the first rider reached the edge of the clearing, lightning forked across the sky, lighting the valley for an instant. Braden saw everything. The rain-soaked coats, the determined faces, the way their boots dug into the mud. He waited until they were within 20 yards. Then he stepped into view. The leader froze mid-step, shaking water from his eyes. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he shouted over the storm. Hand her over, and we're gone. Braden didn't flinch. She's not yours. She ain't yours either, the man growled. She's property of a man who paid good money. Braden's jaw set. People aren't property. Another rider stepped forward. This won't end well. Don't be a fool. Braden lifted the rifle slowly, the barrel steady despite the rain hitting the glass. Go back the way you came. The leader narrowed his eyes. Last chance. Lightning flashed again, and the man raised his carbine. Braden fired first. The bullet struck the ground inches from the rider's foot, a deliberate warning shot that sent mud splattering. The rider jumped back, cursing. The others spread wide, trying to flank the cabin under cover of darkness. Tahia watched through the thin crack in the cellar door, her hands covering her mouth, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it outside. She saw Braden shift positions to the left window, moving silently like a man who had done this before. The rain grew heavier. The riders hesitated. One tried circling the back, unaware Braden had reinforced the wall. The boards held firm. Braden stepped to the rear window just as the man pressed against the wood. Another warning shot exploded inches from the man's shoulder, splintering the bark of a nearby tree. The rider stumbled back, shouting, "He's not alone. Someone's helping him." Braden didn't correct him. Letting them believe he had backup was an advantage he couldn't afford to waste. The storm worsened, thunder shaking the cabin walls. The men retreated toward the ridge again, regrouping under the trees. Braden watched every step, rifle ready, chest tight with adrenaline. Tahia climbed halfway out of the cellar, whispering urgently. "Are they gone?" "For now," he said, exhaling slowly. "They'll try again." She stepped fully into the room, rain rattling loudly overhead. "Then let me help." "No," Braden said firmly. "You cannot protect both sides of the cabin alone," she insisted. "I can watch the door. I won't shoot. I will warn you if they come." He opened his mouth to argue, but paused when he saw the determination in her eyes. She wasn't trying to be reckless or brave. She was trying to stand with him. He recognized it because the same instinct lived in him. "Stay behind me," he said finally. She nodded and moved beside him, her breath calm now, not frantic. Together they watched the ridge. Minutes dragged. The storm thinned. Rain softened. The wind calmed. A quiet settled, so suddenly it felt unnatural. Braden listened. Tahia listened. Then a voice cut through the calm. "Enough hiding." The leader stepped into the open with his pistol raised, not running, not crouched, simply walking straight toward the cabin. His confidence came from arrogance, not strategy. Tahia's breath hitched. Braden raised his rifle and fired again. A clean, sharp shot that struck the dirt near the man's feet, forcing him backward. The leader lifted his weapon higher. "You're done." Then a loud crack burst from the ridge. A branch snapped under a rider's boot. Braden twisted toward the sound. The leader made a mistake then. He aimed directly at the cabin door. Tahia's eyes went wide. "Braden!" Braden spun back, rifle rising faster than the leader's finger could pull the trigger. He fired at the man's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry that cut through the storm. The remaining riders froze. Braden stepped onto the porch, rifle aimed steady. "That's enough." The wounded man clutched his arm, mud mixing with blood. His expression shifted from anger to fear. The others hesitated, then backed away, realizing this fight wasn't worth dying for. Not against a man willing to stand alone in the rain, defending someone they considered worthless. "You tell your employer," Braden said, voice loud and unshaking, "that the woman he thinks he owns is gone. And if he sends anyone else, they won't leave this valley." The men exchanged tense glances, then retreated toward their horses. They lifted the injured leader and mounted up, glaring back once before riding away into the darkness. Braden didn't lower the rifle until their silhouettes vanished behind the ridge. Only then did he step back inside. Tahia rushed toward him, her hands trembling as she checked him for injuries. "You're bleeding, your arm." "It's nothing," he said, though the graze across his left arm stung sharply. She pressed her palm gently to the wound, her voice tight. "You risked your life for me." He met her eyes in the dim light. "I wasn't going to let them take you." Rain dripped from his hair. Her fingers trembled against his sleeve. He reached up slowly and touched her cheek, brushing away a tear she didn't feel fall. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She stepped closer until her forehead rested against his chest, her hands gripping his shirt gently, as though steadying herself after a long fall. "Braden," she whispered, voice shaking with relief. "I don't want to run anymore." He wrapped his arm around her, steady and warm. "You don't have to." She lifted her face to his, her eyes full of something deeper than gratitude, something that had been building steadily since the moment he lifted her from the dirt. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't move. Their lips met softly, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty as she pressed closer. The storm began to break outside, the last rumble of thunder fading behind the ridge. Inside the cabin, warmth returned. Safety returned. A future formed quietly between them, unforced, unasked, but real. They stood in the center of the cabin, holding each other as if the danger outside had finally released its grip on their lives. Tahia touched his jaw gently. "What happens now?" Braden looked down at her, his voice steady and sure. "Now we build something different. No more fear. No more running. No more being hunted." Tahia leaned against him, feeling, for the first time since her village fell, that she had a home again. And Braden, pulling her close, understood that the cabin wasn't empty anymore. Their story had found its end, and its beginning.